The date on the log reads July 14th. The researcher who wrote it had a PhD in atmospheric physics from MIT. He had survived 2 previous Antarctic winters without incident. On that morning, according to the official record, he walked out of the base at 3:47 a.m. into a whiteout blizzard, wearing only his thermals. The external temperature was minus 62 degrees Celsius. He did not take his radio. He did not take his survival pack. And no one noticed he was gone for 6 hours. By the time the search party found his footprints in the snow, they led exactly 40 meters from the exit door and then stopped. Just stopped, as if the ice had simply swallowed him whole. And here is what the report never explained. The emergency door had been bolted from the outside. Stay with me, because what happened at that station, and what's been documented across a dozen Antarctic bases over the past 70 years, is not a ghost story. It is something far more unsettling. It is a precise, clinically documented sequence of neurological collapse that the human brain undergoes when it is stripped of everything it needs to function. And the people who studied it have been trying to warn us since 1961. Let me tell you exactly how it works. You have to understand what Antarctica actually is before any of this makes sense. Most people picture it as a cold, remote place that is technically accurate in the same way that saying a nuclear reactor is technically just a very warm room. The Antarctic continent does not merely have cold weather. It is the single most hostile environment a conscious human being can physically inhabit on this planet. During the polar winter, which runs from roughly April through September, the sun does not rise. Not once. Not for a single hour. For 6 consecutive months, the sky above certain Antarctic research stations is a featureless black ceiling, broken only by the occasional aurora australis, a light so ethereal and beautiful that multiple researchers have described it as deeply disturbing, a reminder that beauty in Antarctica is always attached to danger. The temperature during that period can reach minus 80 degrees Celsius at Vostok Station. At that level, unprotected exposed skin freezes in under 30 seconds. Jet fuel gels and aircraft fuel lines, making any evacuation attempt during the deep winter months technically impossible. The Antarctic Treaty System's protocol is blunt on this point. Between the months of mid-February and late October, if you are stationed at certain interior bases, you are not leaving under any circumstances short of a life-threatening medical emergency. And even then, the odds are not in your favor. The closest parallel in the entire psychological literature is not prison. It is not even solitary confinement. The closest parallel is being sealed inside a submarine that can never surface. Except the submarine is made of thin metal walls that groan and flex against minus 60 temperatures outside, and the sound it makes at 3 in the morning are indistinguishable to a sleep-deprived human brain from someone slowly trying to push through them. Now, if you watched our breakdown of the Nutty Putty Cave incident, you remember what extreme confinement does to the human perception of time. In the cave, the collapse happened over hours. What we're talking about here is a process that unfolds over months, which is in many ways far worse, because there is no single moment of crisis. There is no alarm that goes off. There is only a slow, invisible erosion, and by the time anyone recognizes what is happening, the erosion has already gone too far to stop. Here is the clinical sequence, exactly as documented by Antarctic medical researchers. It begins in the first 4 weeks. This is deceptively benign. Researchers reported general fatigue, minor irritability, difficulty sleeping through the artificial light-dark cycles the base uses to simulate a normal day. Most attribute this to adjustment. Most are wrong. What is actually happening is that the brain's suprachiasmatic nucleus, the region responsible for regulating circadian rhythm, has begun to lose its external anchor. Without sunlight, without the daily cue that tells every biological clock on Earth what time it is, the internal clock begins to drift. Sleep cycles shift, then fragment, then, for some individuals, collapse entirely. By week 8, the cognitive symptoms become measurable. Researchers score noticeably lower on standardized memory tests. Not catastrophically lower, not yet, but lower in a way that, if it happened to you at a desk in an office building, a doctor would order a brain scan. Short-term memory encoding becomes unreliable. People forget what they said 10 minutes ago. They forget words, not obscure words, common words, the kind of words you have used 10,000 times. The medical term for this is cognitive blunting. The researchers themselves call it something else. They call it the fog. But here is what the official reports consistently understate, because I have read the primary source documents, and what the researchers describe in their personal journals is not blunting. It is not fog. What they describe in their own handwriting is something far closer to what we would recognize as early-stage dissociation, a sense that the base is not real, that the walls are not walls but the interior of something alive, that the sound of the ventilation ducts, a constant low metallic hum that permeates every room in every Antarctic station ever built, is not a mechanical sound but a biological one, a breathing, a waiting. This is not metaphor. This is neurology, and the mechanism behind it is devastatingly well understood. The human auditory system does not simply receive sound. It actively constructs it. In an environment rich with stimuli, traffic, voices, music, wind, rainfall, the brain is constantly filtering, comparing, discarding. The neural pathways responsible for sound processing are kept busy. But in the Antarctic void, where the only sounds are the ventilation hum, the occasional crack of contracting metal, and the wind, which, at full Antarctic storm velocity, produces a sound that researchers consistently describe as a human scream. Those same pathways have almost nothing to process, and so they begin to generate. The brain, starved for input, starts manufacturing its own. Auditory hallucinations in Antarctic researchers are not a rare psychiatric symptom. They are a documented, expected, statistically normal consequence of extended polar night exposure. By month 3, the majority of wintering over researchers report hearing things that are not there. The most common? Footsteps. Not scrambled, chaotic, obviously hallucinatory noise. Clean, rhythmic, purposeful footsteps in empty corridors. Footsteps that stop when you open a door and look. Footsteps that resume when you close it. The neurological explanation is precise. The brain, having identified a pattern in the random mechanical sounds of the base, the exact right frequency of a duct flex or a floorboard creak, locks onto it as familiar, fills in the gaps, and serves it to conscious awareness as a complete auditory experience. You hear footsteps because your brain built footsteps from the raw material mechanical noise, and it did so because the alternative, acknowledging that the sound means nothing, that nothing is coming, that nothing will ever come, is something the human perceptual system is architecturally incapable of accepting. And if that were all it was, it would be frightening but manageable. But it is not all. There is phenomenon documented at Vostok Station, at Amundsen-Scott, at the British Halley Research Station, and at no fewer than 6 other Antarctic outposts. The researchers who first cataloged it did not name it. The name came later, from a psychologist studying explorers who had survived extreme isolation in other contexts. The Arctic, solo ocean voyages, high-altitude mountaineering. He called it the third man factor. And what it describes is this. After an extended period of severe isolation, a significant percentage of individuals begin to perceive the presence of an additional person who is not there. Not a vague unease, not a general sensation of being watched. A specific, located, persistent presence. A presence that, in many cases, is experienced as benevolent, protective, like a companion who arrived without announcement and seems to understand without being told what the individual is going through. Ernest Shackleton wrote about it after his crossing of South Georgia Island. He described, with complete matter-of-factness, a 4th man walking beside him and his 2 companions over the mountains. Frank Worsley and Tom Crean, his companions on that crossing, independently reported the same presence. T.S. Eliot read Shackleton's account and incorporated it into The Wasteland. But here is the detail that the literary analysis always omits. Shackleton's party had been awake for nearly 40 hours, had not eaten a real meal in days, and were moving through one of the most featureless landscapes on Earth. The conditions for the third man factor to emerge were essentially perfect. In the Antarctic base context, the factor takes a slightly different and, in clinical terms, more alarming form, because in the base, unlike on an open ice field, the perceived presence has a location. It is in the next room. It is around the corner. It is the source of the footsteps. And unlike Shackleton's benevolent companion, The presence perceived in the closed base environment is frequently not experienced as friendly. It is experienced as watching, as calculating, as having been there before the researchers arrived, and as intending to remain after they leave. I want to stop here and make something clear, because I know exactly where your mind is going, and I want to redirect it with a very specific piece of documentation. This is not mythology. This is not local legend or campfire horror. The third man factor in Antarctic isolation is a peer-reviewed, NIH-funded area of active neurological research. The mechanism is now understood with reasonable precision. The right temporoparietal junction, a region of the brain responsible for constructing the sense of self in relation to space, begins, under conditions of extreme sensory deprivation, to incorrectly attribute the individual's own bodily sensations and movements to an external agent. Your body shifts in a chair. The brain does not register that as your own movement. It registers it as something else in the room moving. Your own breathing in the silence becomes someone else's breathing. The self begins to experience its own existence as a haunting. Now let us talk about what the body is doing while the mind unravels. The Epheto T3, the T3 effect, is a physiological cascade that Antarctic medical researchers identified in the 1980s and that the broader medical community has been, to put it charitably, slow to take seriously. T3 is triiodothyronine, a thyroid hormone critical for neurological function, metabolic regulation, and, crucially, emotional stability in cold, dark environments with restricted caloric variety and disrupted sleep. T3 levels in the blood drop significantly in some Antarctic winters, by as much as 40% below baseline. The behavioral consequences are specific and terrifying. Individuals become impulsive. Risk assessment collapses. Emotional regulation, the capacity to experience frustration, fear, or anger, and then choose proportionate response, simply stops working the way it should. Researchers who were, by all accounts, reasonable and cooperative in the first weeks of winter begin to have explosive arguments over trivial things, over who used the last of the coffee, over whose turn it is to maintain the weather instruments, over what music is playing in the common room. These are not personality conflicts. These are T3-mediated neurological events wearing the costume of personality conflicts. And the tragedy is that the researchers experiencing them, even when they know about the T3 effect, even when they've been briefed on it, even when they're physicians themselves, cannot distinguish on the inside between a legitimate grievance and a hormone-driven cascade. The anger feels real. It feels proportionate. It feels like the most justified thing in the world. And this is where it gets truly dangerous. Not because of the conflict itself, but because of what the conflict does to the most critical resource available to any Antarctic wintering crew: trust. In an environment where the next rescue flight is 4 months away, trust is not a social nicety. It is infrastructure. It is the invisible architecture that makes every other safety protocol function. If a researcher needs a medical procedure, and the only available surgeon is someone they had a screaming argument with 2 weeks ago over the coffee, the question of whether they can rely on that surgeon is not trivial. It is existential. And the documented record of Antarctic winter incidents is full of examples of exactly the scenario playing out. Not with violence in most cases, but with a slow breakdown of cooperative function, so complete that basic station maintenance begins to fail. Equipment goes unchecked. Safety inspections get skipped. Log entries become cryptic, angry, or simply stop. Which brings us to the night of July 14th, and the man with the PhD from MIT. His name is withheld in the public version of the incident report, referred to only as Researcher D. He had been at the station for 93 days. By the station log, his behavior in the final 2 weeks before the incident had followed the precise clinical template: erratic sleep, missed meals, increasing isolation from the rest of the team, and 3 separate documented arguments with colleagues over issues that his supervisor described as, quote, completely trivial. On July 12th, he had written in his personal log, a log that was recovered after the incident and forms part of the official documentation, a single sentence that the investigators flagged as the most significant item in the entire record. The sentence read, "I keep hearing it come back at night. I know what it is. I know it isn't real. But knowing what it is doesn't make it stop." He was describing the footsteps, but he was also describing something more specific. The moment at which cognitive knowledge and perceptual experience fully decouple. The moment at which a man who knows, intellectually, scientifically, without any ambiguity, that the sound is a hallucination, can no longer use that knowledge to make the hallucination stop. That is the threshold. That is the point of no return. Not the first hallucination. Not the first argument. Not even the first thought that something in the base is not what it appears to be. The point of no return is when rational knowledge becomes neurologically insufficient to override perceptual experience. After that point, the base is no longer a workplace. It is an environment. It is alive. It moves. It watches. And the only remaining question is what the individual does with that truth. At 3:47 a.m. on July 14th, researcher D walked out the emergency exit in his thermals. What followed is documented in the official incident report and in a supplementary psychological analysis filed by the station's senior medical officer 8 months later. The search party, when it found the footprints, noted something that the initial report mentioned but did not explain. The footprints show that researcher D had walked in a straight line for exactly 40 meters, had stopped, had turned around once, the depression in the snow showing a complete 360-degree rotation, and had then moved off the path in a direction that led, had he continued, directly away from the station and into the open polar plateau. He was found 212 meters from the exit, partially sheltered behind a weather monitoring outcropping, in a state of what the medical report describes as severe hypothermia with intact consciousness. He was alive. He recovered. He never returned to Antarctica. In his debriefing, conducted 6 weeks after his evacuation, he was asked why he had gone outside without his gear. He said he did not know. He said that at the time it had seemed necessary. He said, and this is the sentence the psychological analysis returns to 3 separate times. He said that something inside the station had been following him for 2 weeks, and that on that night he had decided that the cold outside was preferable to what was inside. He knew, by that point, that this was a symptom. He had known it was a symptom the entire time. The knowledge had not protected him. Now, I need to tell you about Leonid Rogozov, because Rogozov is the most important data point in this entire case. Not because of the horror of what he did, but because of what it proves about the human capacity for rational function under impossible circumstances. And the contrast with what happened to researcher D is what makes Antarctica, as a case study in human limits, so genuinely extraordinary. It was 1961, the Soviet Novolazarevskaya station. Rogozov was 27 years old, the only physician at the station, and he was experiencing the classic acute symptoms of appendicitis. Localized right lower quadrant pain, fever of 38.1, progressive nausea. He knew exactly what was happening. He also knew that the nearest surgeon capable of performing an appendectomy was on another continent. The Antarctic winter made evacuation impossible. Without intervention, he would be dead within days, possibly hours if the appendix perforated. What Leonid Rogozov did next was not the act of a man who had lost his grip on reality. It was the act of a man whose grip on reality was so absolute, so unbreakable, that he was able to perform surgery on himself. A surgical procedure he had performed dozens of times on others, but had never before had to perform without being able to see what he was doing, lying on his back, working by touch and by mirror under local anesthesia that he had administered himself, with 2 station colleagues holding instruments beside him who had no medical training and who were, by their own account, trembling throughout. He worked for 1 hour and 45 minutes. He made the incision. He located the appendix. He found it was severely inflamed and nearly at the point of perforation. He removed it. He sutured the wound. He cleaned up. He asked his colleagues to help him to his bunk. He was back on medical duty within 2 weeks. The Soviet Antarctic expedition report on the procedure is 6 pages long. Rogozov's own account of it occupies roughly 1 paragraph. Because he did not consider it remarkable. He considered it a technical problem that required a technical solution. The environment had given him no other option, and so he had found the option that existed. Here is why this matters in the context of what I've been telling you. Rogozov and researcher D were both isolated in Antarctica. Both were experienced professionals. Both encountered a situation for which their training had not fully prepared them. The difference is not courage. The difference is not intelligence. The difference is the specific nature of the threat. Rogozov's threat was external, physical, and actionable. He could see it, or rather, he could feel it, and he could act on it in a way that produced a measurable result. Researcher D's threat was internal, neurological, and completely non-actionable. There was no procedure performed. There was no instrument to pick up. The enemy was the instrument. The enemy was the brain doing exactly what evolution designed it to do, protecting itself, making its environment legible, manufacturing presence out of absence, and doing so in a setting where those same protective mechanisms had become lethal. Antarctica does not kill you the way other environments kill you. It does not kill you with sudden violence. It kills you with patience. It kills you the way a very experienced interrogator works, by taking away one by one every reference point you have for what is real, until you make a decision that makes perfect sense from the inside and no sense at all from the outside. The researchers who design Antarctic wintering protocols have known this for decades. The countermeasures they have developed are meticulous. Mandatory psychological evaluations every 3 weeks, structured social interaction requirements, light therapy lamps calibrated to specific spectrums, carefully managed caloric intake to support T3 levels, regular satellite video calls with family members, exercise requirements, even mandatory noise breaks, periods where the ventilation system is briefly shut down and the base is allowed to be truly silent on the counterintuitive theory that controlled silence is less damaging than the constant manufactured sound that the brain has begun to animate. And yet, incidents continue. Not at every station, not every year, but they continue, because the protocols address the symptoms and not the source. The source is not the darkness. It is not the cold. It is not the isolation in any simple sense. The source is a fundamental incompatibility between the conditions that the human brain requires to maintain its architecture reality and the conditions that Antarctica provides. Strip away sunlight, and you strip away the circadian anchor. Strip away the circadian anchor and sleep fractures. Strip away functional sleep and the prefrontal cortex, the part of you that says, this isn't real, this is a hallucination, this is a T3 effect, you know this, begins to go offline. And when it does, what remains is older and simpler and more honest, an animal in the dark, hearing something coming. The researcher who came home from that July night has never spoken publicly about what happened. The official report was classified for 4 years and released only partially under a Freedom of Information request filed by a Norwegian investigative journalist in 2019. The supplementary psychological analysis has never been released. The station where the incident occurred is still operational. There are people there right now, as you watch this, in the middle of the Antarctic winter, in the dark, listening to the ventilation ducts and try to remember that what they hear is not what it sounds like. For the survivors who make it through a full Antarctic winter and return to civilization, the standard medical term for their readjustment period is re-entry syndrome. They struggle with crowds. They struggle with noise, real noise, the random, unpatterned noise of a city, which the brain that has spent months constructing meaning from near silence now processes as overwhelming and chaotic. They struggle most of all with what several of them have described in almost identical language in psychological literature. A persistent sense that the real world is somehow less real than the base was. That the base, with its grinding walls and its hallucinated footsteps and its paranoid silences, had shown them something about the nature of consciousness that civilian life actively conceals. That they had seen, as one researcher put in a 2018 interview, the machinery underneath, the neural architecture that constructs reality from noise, presence from absence, meaning from the void. Antarctica doesn't drive researchers mad. It shows them how sane they always were, by showing them exactly how thin the border is between sanity and its opposite, and how little it takes, in the right conditions, to cross it. The bolt on that emergency door, the one that was bolted from the outside. The incident report flagged it as a mechanical anomaly, likely caused by the extreme cold contracting the metal housing, the locking mechanism. The investigation concluded there was no indication that any other person had operated the latch. The temperature at the time of the incident was minus 62 degrees Celsius. No one else had gone outside that night. The investigation is closed. The station is still open. The winter is still happening.